the work and exhibits and archives of the International Slavery Museum to be sung through and spoken through the words of migrants today. Standing in the International Slavery Museum, they have an audio exhibit, and I listened to the work of the last poets, and this was my response. We are the first poets of a birthing nation emerging from the open, bloody wound of Europe. When Donald Trump says, it's a shame, when Donald Trump says, allowing immigration to take place in Europe is a shame, we are born. We are the children of Sister Rosa. We are the children of Brother Jesse, 1936, and to his head in a dignified salute that by 1968 is the raised fist of Tommy Smith. We are the first poets, said Jennifer Verson. We are the first poets, said Faiza, said Aram, said Anstey, said Shani. We are the first poets, said Amina, said Shamsa, said Radwinder. We are the first poets, said Aisha, said Kanwal, said Farah, said Rajbir, said Elizabeth. We are the first poets, said Parveen, said Jasmine, said Miriam. We are the first poets of our new voice, born together, holding hands. For 7, an amniotic fluid of hope, swirling around us, whispering, never again, never again, never again. We are the first poets, words stuttering from our mouths as we learn to speak a new language, a new mother tongue. My mother tongue is freedom, whispered to me at the breast as I whisper to my own daughter as she grows louder and stronger. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom. And I whisper to my sister as we emerge from the drowning seas of never again, never again, never again. We are the first poets learning this new mother tongue, Urdu, Punjabi, Swahili, Hebrew, Arabic, French, Spanish, Catalan, Greek. We are the first poets with the first words learning to speak a new language. We start here with our first word, Mama.
Great. I am really, really happy to be here this evening to have this opportunity to speak about the work of Migrant Artists Mutual Aid and my work as the artistic director. Responding directly because over the course of 9 years, our creative work has used affect to craft a new aesthetics of citizenship and to really consider how political solidarity and shared lives has the potential for political impact. And as this is just a provocation, I'm going to show you a little bit about our work and try and hit the core parts. One of the key aspects is essentialized maternality. When we talk about this, it's resisting this idea of the maternal being used by the nation states. And we do this through crafting a relationship of shared lives and political solidarity that goes beyond race, class, particularly religion, and finds a new type of political agency. This political agency and this friendship of the shared lives where we're connected through our experiences of love, loss, and migration is then transformed over long relationships into art forms that are then able to be amplified. And this amplification has the potential for political agency through this idea of an ontology of interconnection, which I'll be speaking about tonight. Briefly, I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the aesthetics that we're talking about. One of the things as the vision of my artistic work is that I'm building a political theology that's more robust than empathy. What we experienced, especially when you've been through a traumatic migration, is that you don't necessarily find joy or happiness in sharing your story. So we are looking at different aesthetic ways to contest the dehumanization of refugees through our relationships with each other, as opposed to trying to build empathy through this idea of compassion for a victim. So we're reading these victim narratives in our creative work. The tenets of this, you'll see, as you can see in our images, is this idea of shared lives, and that these shared lives move towards a cultural prefiguration. So our bodies together in performance, different races, different religions, different nations of origin, different languages, but singing in harmony in voices in many languages gives has produced affect in both ourselves and our audience. And this then crafts the potential for a new type of citizenship. And then this new type of citizenship is grounded in political action, where through our performance we've raised money and we take on challenging government policy around migration that doesn't recognize women seeking sanctuary from gender-based violence. One of the other key tenets is this idea of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is mastering the past. Now, what our most recent work has been is interpreting the Slavery Museum archives into new music that's sung by current migrants, and by tracing a line from the past of genocide, enslavement, and empire and colonialization through current people who are experiencing forced migration, seeking refuge. We're able to craft an effective remembrance of shared values. And these shared values are enacted through a performance in specific sites. Particularly, I wanted to open up with a poem that was based on the work in the Slavery Museum, so that you'd have a sense of the type of work we're doing. The whole body of work was a 6-song cycle that worked through looking at the history of resistance to slavery as well. This is an image from that cycle, which works that you'll see us singing in the Walker Art Gallery, and the work of Elena Hamid. So it's destabilizing and creating multi-layered performances that can be experienced, and they're undergirded by our relationship with each other, which is fighting quite robustly and explicitly for justice in the migration system for each of us, as well as finding a harmony and a common vocal experience that is particular to performance. And as you see in this moment in the Walker Art Gallery, it interprets as well the complex history of slavery and imagines through our bodies a different future where our post-nationalist solidarity and motherhood is seen as a spot of agency. And I will end there because my alarm has just gone off, but just with the final words of, we do believe that this works because, as in the words of Connolly, no ecology of late capitalism, given the variety of forces to which it is connected, 1,000 pulleys, vibrations, impingements, dependencies, shocks, threads, can specify with supreme confidence the stability or potential flexibility of the structure it seeks to change. So in terms of social change, these micro interventions have the capacity for impact on policy.
I'll just preface perhaps, because with saying that I'm a sociologist, I have been using and working with colleagues and using participatory theatre methods, and that's what I'll be talking about a bit today. But the way that we've approached that, or I have approached it in this particular that I'm talking about, is to look at how we can use participatory theatre as a research method, as a method of knowledge production, of co-producing knowledges together between researchers, research participants, activists, and practitioners in some cases. But for a long time, I've been interested in how we can think about migrant mothers as citizens. And one of the one of the important approaches that I find has been to look at how you can think about migrant mothers enacting citizenship. That means following Engin Aysen's work, challenging the borders and boundaries of what citizenship means and what it should mean. And we've looked at it in this project is we've been looking at the ways in which migrant families contest the ways in which they are marginalized in public and political debates, and in particular migrant mothers and families are often seen as traditional, and for that reason they're seen as standing in the way of their children's integration. This is sometimes this is, let's say, mobilized. These kind of discourses, political discourses, are mobilized from time to time. It's about telling migrant families to speak English at home, or on a regular basis, more recently, migrant mothers being made seen as responsible for their children's political radicalization. So yes, and migrant families in that way are really seen as they're in the boundaries of UK society or as outsiders to UK society. However, what we've been trying to do with our work is to challenge these approaches and instead really them perhaps upside down, or maybe and to look at how migrant mothers are construct their sense of belonging and placemaking, and how that already in itself is a claim to citizenship and to participation. And then instead using these lived experiences of migrant mothers' citizenship as a starting point to critique the way in which the state and also everyday cultures produce quite exclusionary and racist understandings of citizenship. So I'll be talking about project Participatory Arts and Social Action Research, which was a 2-year project funded by the ESRC, National Center for Research Methods, that I worked on with my colleagues Elena, who was the research fellow and also the Participatory Theatre facilitator, Megan Neal, who is now at the University College Cork, and Tracy Reynolds, who's at University of Greenwich. And we've been focusing on how we can use participatory action research to generate new knowledge and insights into social exclusion that marginalized communities encounter, in particular migrant families. And we've looked at how we can reach broader audiences through the website. I'll share that in a moment in the chat, and also developed a toolkit and resources, and mainly for researchers. But what we looked at research, say, in a broader perspective, also beyond and outside of academia. So researchers who are practitioners, perhaps, or community researchers, activists, etc. So the project has explored the opportunities and challenges of participatory action research. And in particular, we've looked at participatory forum theatre and walking stories and how they enable us to engage with migrant women, girls, and families, and to better understand the issues that are affecting migrant families. We've looked at how we can use these methods to make a difference and an impact on practice and policy. And in particular, how we can use these to co-produce knowledge around a policy issue. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that issue, that's no recourse to public funds. Here's just a picture of policy day. So no recourse to public funds. Some of you may be quite familiar with it. Some of you might not know very much about it. I'll be very, very brief here. We've written a little bit more about elsewhere. Is a policy that prevents migrants from accessing the social support that is necessary really to support their survival yeah, and that's something that affects has affected increasingly large numbers of migrants. It's been in force for decades, actually, but with the especially Theresa May's hostile environment since 2012, it has been extended. This policy has been extended to more and more migrants. It is covering now everyone who is subject to migration control. It means that if people encounter a crisis in their lives, such as unemployment, divorce, separation, ill health, they would usually depend on social welfare, and as migrants, then they're not able to depend on social welfare. So this is actually one of the ways in which our citizenship laws, our immigration laws are very clearly delimiting this particular group of migrants and delimiting their rights to bring up their families in dignity and care for them in dignity. So we've worked with a group of migrant women with no recourse to public funds. And I want to share with you just about 1 minute of that film, of a very short film about this project, and I hope you'll find a chance to look at it in your own time later.
When I first came to the group, I had no idea what I was getting into. I thought it was just a group of women from different backgrounds just speaking about how they manage with everyday life in London with children, having no recourse to public funds.
We have some councillors coming from Acton.
I've been homeless for like 6 months. I've been sleeping in church with my little boy. Eventually, when I went to the social services, they gave us a room to stay. And my boy was like, I'm happy. I'm a king. This is my room. I can do what I like in this room.
Mommy, why do we have to move all the time? I don't like it, Mommy. And he keeps on, so he's very cranky all the time. Within 2 months, I've moved about five different times. So it's very, very challenging. The difficult ones was listening to how much pain, how much suffering that mothers have to go through having no recourse to public funds.
It's not my identity. I'm not a migrant. Last year, that's when they stopped me from working when the immigration came to my house.
We have to.
So yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to give you a taste really of this, and it'll be great to talk about this more later in the. Let's now conclude. So to look at how I see that research can also form an act of citizenship, and I mentioned earlier what an act of citizenship is a way of challenging the exclusionary boundaries of our current normative understandings of citizenship. So in this project, and maybe more broadly participatory arts for research, we challenge the relationship between researchers and participants, and allowing participants to articulate and share their own subjugated knowledges. It can allow us to develop new knowledges together with researchers and contest existing discourses and marginalize migrant families And in that way, actually, it can become a shared act of challenging existing ways of knowing and thinking about migrant families as outsiders to the nation, and in that way challenge social injustices that are part and parcel of these ways of knowing.
I guess I'd like to premise this talk by saying that it is something of a departure from the first two. As a Black American, much of the work I do relates to the experience of the complexity that is the African diaspora in the United States. I'll just leave that there. So in this talk, I will illustrate the ongoing practice of synthesizing family and studio and discuss how the life and the work are each other's catalysts. I think of my studio practice as something of an autopoetic system, one that is inextricably bound to reactive with and evidence of my life within the studio, An autopoetic system encourages the evolution of all its parts. It is a self-engendering of life from life. Autopoiesis is a process which produces the potential for transformation and the creation of novelty from within itself. It is an optimistic entropic system that is self-sustaining and the parts are symbiotically related. It's also reactive to internal and external forces and must perpetually adapt and morph to thrive. I should probably say that we were walking through the, I think it was the Whitney Museum, and my son decided that it was better to look at these paintings laying down. I think he was right. I wear the many hats of artist, activist, professor, and mother. Considering the future means considering the ideal trajectories of these interdependent roles and how to cultivate a life that nurtures each. The past few years have marked a shift in my practice, due in part to the fact that teaching and working collaboratively have been so rewarding. Motherhood, single motherhood especially. All of these factors have catalyzed a reevaluation of the work I do as an artist and as a citizen. Previously, I created more formal, discrete works. Since the birth of my son, my practice has become more politically engaged, collaborative, experiential, and experimental. Oh, he's coming over to say hi. Here he is.
Hi.
The socio-critical element, which I think was part of the introduction, but I'll say it again, is largely inspired by Sylvan and his perennially posed why. It's inspired by what an art bird is described as un claque. As events unfolding in local and national politics have compelled me to react, I find myself having to distill things like white supremacy into 7-year-old terms. Such distillation or translation requires a re-examination of the factors that determine my socio-political positionality. I do not always have definitive answers for his oft-posed whys or what is, though I would say I'm experiencing some kind of claque. It is demanding my recalibration of meanings a priori and my position in this world. This work, more than any other I have made, feels and is critical. I feel I can't not make it. One such recent work was inspired by my inability to empathize with mothers who'd lost their children to state violence. I cannot imagine losing my son, nor can I conjure the language to explain these deaths to him. Reaching the limit of what is comprehensible, the words in the relentless newspaper accounts I read become abstracted into pure form. Following the illogical or alternative reading methods explored in my earlier works, explication de texte examines the idea of close reading in a manner that is both to the letter and tongue-in-cheek.
Hey, we did that in class.
Explication de texte is a method for fleshing out the meaning embedded in written works through group discussion. In an effort to make sense of the killings of unarmed Black people, we discuss news media accounts of these events. We attempt something like a close reading. But discursive analysis finds its limits here, as it fails to reconcile the space between sympathy and empathy. The grief of a mother recounting the loss of her son is impossible to imagine. It tests our emotional potentials. Imagined an analysis of the forms of the newspaper text might yield some explanations otherwise unattainable. To create this piece, I photographed the phrase, "shot my son," as it appeared in the New York Times under a confocal microscope at 20x magnification. The final image, which you see here, is composed of hundreds of microscope scans pieced together again and printed as a newspaper. 2,000 copies have been printed to be exhibited and given away. I wanted viewers to share my experience of witnessing the phrase, "shot my son," in a newspaper. As the phrase stands alone on the pages, all other content falls away. Like the previous piece, this next series entitled Testimony was inspired by my inability to process news about state violence against Black people, youth especially. I guess I've always thought that newspapers seemed too pedestrian or flimsy to deliver such horrific content. I wanted to make text that was literally too caustic for the substrate on which it was printed. So I researched paper eating and discovered iron gall ink, which is made by creating a tannic liquid from fermented oak tree galls. The excess of iron sulfate in many folk recipes for this ink makes it unstable, since it rusts and in doing so creates sulfuric acid, which eats paper. Testimony consists of newspaper articles containing the victim's mother's testimony, and copied in iron gall ink. The text, through a process of accelerated oxidization, eats through the paper. The past few years, my practice has also become more collaborative. These collaborative projects are as integral a part of my practice as the bodies of work we've just seen. I'm co-founder of an oral history archiving project called the Black Lunch Table, which is an ongoing project begun with New York-based artist Heather Hart. I think I might rush through this part. We started in 2005, and our initiative seeks to mobilize a democratic rewriting of contemporary cultural history by animating discourse around and among the people living it. As the past few years have seen the most public discourse around issues of race in recent memory, BLT has provided a critical platform for exchange, currently staging and recording community roundtables at institutions nationwide and now internationally. Our original initiative, the Artist Roundtable, provides space to address issues directly affecting contemporary artists of the African diaspora. People's Table session is open to everyone, and this session seeks to cross-pollinate discourse amongst community constituents. It also intends to foster new productive relationships to continue the movement for dismantling institutional racism. At our editathons, we train participants to create and update Wikipedia articles pertaining to the lives and works of artists of the African diaspora. This is a reason that we edit Wikipedia as well. These statistics show the bias and the potential bias in editing, since people edit what they're interested in. Lastly, teaching. The past few years have also marked a shift in my practice due in part to the fact that teaching has been so rewarding. Writing lesson plans has catalyzed a reevaluation of the work I do as an artist and a citizen. This is a picture from a class visit to a library archive, which Sylvan joined us for. I believe that it is possible, if not absolutely necessary, to challenge students to cultivate practices that critically engage aesthetic, art historical, and socio-political discourses, that they ought to be challenged to reflect on their roles and responsibilities as students, artists, and members of their local and global communities. Perhaps this is what mothering is, an emphasis on teaching to care and to listen. And this here is just a shameless plug for my dear friend Krista Donner, who runs an amazing project called Cultural Reproducers, which offers resources for parenting artists and creatives, and has interviews with people. And so this is one with me and Sylvan and Swanjun and her mother Honan, who's a sometimes collaborator and dear friend.
Part 1. There are other worlds they have not told you of. I borrowed this title from a track Sun Ra released in 1978, the year I was born, for his album Liquidity. One of Sun Ra's most haunting space anthems and easily the most sorrowful. There seems to be a weariness that separates this theme from all the others he composed. Sun Ra's music remained unknown to me until I heard it late one night in friend's flat in Chicago in 2003, during monthly meetings we held as a group of disenfranchised students at one of the most expensive art schools in USA. Many of us were from what West framed as the Global South. These gatherings were for us an embodiment of Fanon's argument on political solidarity between the Third World masses in the post-war era. We discussed endlessly issues of representation and why, at the prestigious institutions we all attended, mostly as token students, it was considered passé. But it was the kind of early 2000s, and the world basked in excess. The East-West divide was gone, and everyone believed we will abolish borders altogether. Gender and race were not considered issues worth discussing anymore. But not for us. Never for us. So while Sun Ra's track hauntingly whispered in my ear, there are other worlds, they want to speak to you, I was quickly learning the boundaries of my disprivilege. I arrived at the most expensive art school in USA by pure luck, and I would like to think some talent and hard work. Using old prospectus handed over to me by a professor who did a Fulbright in Chicago in the 80s, and some basic internet searches, this is kind of early 2000s, so the colleges still haven't fully grasped the potential of internet, I dared to apply to schools in USA. It was the only way out of the poverty that haunted my generation since childhood. It was that or getting married for papers, or working endlessly in low-paid illegal jobs. However, what I quickly learned in the school is how privilege works and how reckless humanity can be. Most of my white privileged MA colleagues generally assumed everything speaks to and for them. Art is timeless, truths are universal. At the apocalypse, they'll be right up front, credit cards out and ready to book the best rooms. As precarious migrant, I was at the end of that line. Poor luck, born at the wrong time, wrong place. But there are other worlds they have not told you of. They wish to speak to you. Part 2. In 2018, I started a collaborative project with the researchers and artists Caroline Defrain and the filmmaker Winston Witten. This project grew from our observation that the last 10 years of hostile environment in the UK, the instability, the lack of sense of belonging, and the desire to make a change inspired enormous creative response from artists that come from migrant backgrounds. We felt that it is important to address this response and to understand the motivation of artists to creatively criticize the hostile political climate. We engaged in a dialogue with 6 other migrant artists in UK and Germany over a period of 18 months. We decided to work in a non-hierarchical dynamic as co-researchers and co-creators. We all come from complicated migrant backgrounds that are additionally challenged due to the Coastal Environment Acts. We see our art-based research work as an act of defying what constitutes a good citizen narrative in the UK today. The ways of studying and representing migrants can have world-making effects. Part 3. So I will talk while the movie runs in the background. There are other worlds they have not told you of. Worlds that contain me and you, my child, in a more caring constellation. Worlds. We walk, We explore how thinking with care can affect how we are treated as migrants. I wonder, how do I tell you about the meaning of care from my own migrant marginalized experience of everyday caring for my children? Caring is not a romantic endeavor, nor an exclusive affair of motherly love, but a matter of earthly survival. Hand, brain, and heart have to work together now, not only in future utopian worlds. There are other worlds they have not told you of. Worlds where it is not enough to detect what is there, what is given in the things we study and experience about migration, but also worlds where we think about what is not included and about what migrant could become. Worlds that are constantly rethought, contested, and enriched. How can you capture our journey when the language melts, words disappear, voices are muted? Taking responsibility for what and whom we care for doesn't mean being in charge. Adequate care requires knowledge and curiosity regarding the needs of another, human or not, and this become possible through relating, through refusing objectification. This is about me. I can't depassion knowledge. To depassion knowledge that not gives us a more objective world, it just gives us a world without us and therefore without them. There are other worlds they have not told you of. They wish to speak to you. Thank you.
My intervention is somewhat fragmented, which perhaps is itself expression or representation, kinds of fragments of displacement that characterize so much of the kind of phenomenological experience of life and non-being race mothers and their families, and um, these kind of fractures of displacement that crisscross my own lineages, from the displacement of the Holocaust, from dispossession of indigenous lands, from displacement of um, the kind of Celtic lineages too, and now my own self in this kind of positioning in the lands of Australia, or something um, which can be a space of great pain and dislocation at the same time, as it is always double-sided and also contains the possibilities of these other worlds, such that Elena so beautifully spoke of these other modes of caring and of curiosity and of attention otherwise. And my talk is kind of like an autographic poetic engagement as well, which takes me back to Jina's too. There's some crossovers. And it really is not, even though there's an element of a language which is very conceptual, it's not with the intention to return to abstraction or objectification. It is a refusal of those logics of mapping, containment, speaking about, speaking for, speaking over, and kind of negating the being of racialized mothers and their families. And nor is it a return to essentialism when I talk about a kind of becoming motherwise in terms of political subjectivity and relationships of being and knowing. Rather, I hope it makes, as it always should be considered, speaking from the race maternal, and speaking from the maternal is not merely a kind of concrete, specific, culturally kind of narrow contribution, but rather is a way in which we might reimagine the very contours and grounds of being, becoming, and of world making otherwise. So kind of the beginnings of this are the fracturing, are the idea that modern state and citizenship is premised always on its underside, of the non-being of the racialized and feminized subject. And that these markings of borders, of sovereignty, of political subjecthood, of citizenship, of state, we think about them often in terms of, you know, the kind of camps that we see on the borders between Mexico and the United States. We think of them in terms of the mass displacements through war. We think of them in terms of the kind of mass dispossessions through slavery. But of course, these markings can only ever function when they manifest in the interstices of the every realities of our lives, and the everyday realities of our lives, which mark who is considered citizen proper, who is considered to have agency, history, reason, and who is conversely considered to be a non-being, considered to be a subject always kind of made visible in a gaze which is premised upon suspicion and premised upon the negation of the capacity to gift, and how this subject of modern citizenship is premised in possession and property and power and carelessness, and a relationship of constriction towards the racialized subject of fantasies and fictions of misrepresentation, but which become material reality in the kinds of borders across national boundaries and the internal borders that reproduce this lack of the right to have rights, or this lack of the right to have visibility on one's own terms or voice on one's own terms. And this, of course, has manifested in my own life and in the women in the communities that I work with, and, you know, systematically in the disruption of Black and Indigenous and Mestiza families, and in the negation of Black and Indigenous and Mestiza motherhood, in either our kind of exploitation as the unpaid or overexploited carers of the middle class family and children, and of the loss of their own children through incarceration, through child removal, through these dispossessions, through these migrations, and through being cast with this gaze of suspicion and reframed as bad mothers, as lacking mothers. And these pseudo-fictions that become these scars on the skin and these markings of disruptions in the family are really constitutive of modern citizenship. There is no escape from these logics of constriction and suffocation towards racialized and feminized others. But of course, this non-being, or this situation of the flesh, as Hortense Spillers talks about, is double-sided, because, and something also that Elena said, because our mothering is intimately tied up with our survival, and our reclaiming of a home place otherwise is intimately tied up with emerging in our own registers of visibility and voice, and emerging as knowing being subjects within these fragments of exile, dispossession, disruption, and displacement that we carry in every moment, and that I carry as I sit here displaced as a tenant because of gentrification, which meant our house was full of toxic dust, and we were kind of subject to these racialized logics of suspicion and the denial of the right to life and breath and housing as a raced single mother in ceded lands. So this double-sidedness really involves, and in my practice, which itself disrupts the borders and the boundaries between pedagogy and knowledge making, between education and life, between research and the co-creation of ecologies of intimacies otherwise, this has really centered multiple literacies. So the crisscross here of bringing in poetry, dance, ritual and ceremony, recovering the wisdoms of all our grandmothers, retelling our stories. I know one of the seminars has been about storytelling and motherhood, and really creating the conditions to be authors over our own narratives. So authors not only as narrative as a conceptual representational form or aesthetic, but narrative as a coming into being otherwise, as a chiseling of our faces and a sketching them in the sand so that our presence becomes visible on its own terms. And this really centered home and home place. You know, Bell Hooks writes this beautiful piece about home place and the differences of what home can mean through these lineages and experiences of non-being, but mothering as survival and survivance in the contemporary conditions of state governance and political subjecthood. And it's really centered the home as a place of autonomy and freedom making, as a place of practices which return to the inner territories, the ways in which our inner territories and our interrelationship so deeply marked by these borders of violence, by these bordering practices, but also the recuperation of other forms of knowing, of the wisdoms of our grandmothers, of the capacity to create community otherwise. And so at this precise concept moment that I'm in, this involves thinking together and resisting gentrification in our city, and thinking together of the ways that we can create a home otherwise. We can create a territory and a collective form of home place in co-housing, which is run and centered around Black, Indigenous and single mothers, who we can weave around other forms of reproducing life, other registers of care, and embed this deeply within a radical education project and a decolonizing the production of food and the recuperation of other wisdoms project. And in this way, not return to any essence, kind of an impossibility because of this impurity, but rather come to the table, come to the tables of our own making and share our stories together in a way that renders and opens the possibilities of becoming human otherwise, that renders and opens the possibilities of co-creating other registers of political being, and of co-creating other possibilities of a world that actively disrupts borders and that actively creates a hospitality within the interstices of contesting the violences of citizenship and sovereignty as they crisscross the modern capitalist world. So I think that's my contribution for today. Thank you for listening.